Let's talk about
politics, environmental science,
global warming,
constitutional rights,
social and economic challenges,
money, power, choice.
Nature does not compromise.
extreme droughts, extreme heat waves.
sea levels are rising, and it is
About climate change.
This is
the future of the next generations.
So I just wanted to take a little bit to speak about what the Inflation Reduction Act is. It's the biggest investment the federal government has made so far in our climate. It's a major bill. A lot of it is devoted to climate, but not entirely. And a lot of what is in it both complements what was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And then it also works along with the Farm Bill. So that's why we wanted to make sure it was mentioned tonight. I just wanted to give a few examples of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not the expert tonight, so I'll let our speakers elaborate more. But the Inflation Reduction Act has provided some additional conservation programs that allow, or funding and conservation programs that allow farmers to protect the environment and their farmlands. So previously, these programs that existed, 3/4 of the farmers that applied were turned away due to the lack of funding. And then the Inflation Reduction Act also provides an additional $18 billion in climate smart agriculture that may be adopted in the upcoming Farm Bill, but this is a point of contention and negotiation mainly along party lines where a nonpartisan coalition and organization, but these are kind of the facts as they are right now. And then there's also additional investments in low-income communities that kind of goes along with the Farm Bill's funding in nutrition assistance programs. So the Inflation Reduction Act has programs to help replace lead pipes, improve infrastructure, broadband connectivity, and home decarbonization by providing subsidies. And these are all big needs for low-income communities, along with the nutrition assistance funding that's included in the Farm Bill. And none of this is perfect, and the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't meet all of our climate goals, but it's a start and a major climate win. So we'd just like to share the successes tonight of both the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act and the Farm Bill during this event series. And if you aren't aware, there's 2 sessions. So the first one's tonight, and then we'll have one at the same time tomorrow. But we'll also discuss opportunities for improvement and further action, focusing on how the Inflation Reduction Act has contributed to making the Farm Bill more effective, along with other policies that could contribute to a more sustainable food and agricultural system to uplift all stakeholders, including farmers, underserved communities, and farm workers. So the Inflation Reduction Act required many compromises to pass when it did, and we must continue to push to protect the climate investments that were created by the bill while advocating for additional actions to protect the communities first and worst impacted by climate change. And there's also a lot more that's going on across the US. This is just a start. It's a federal investment, so it's big, but there's also equally important initiatives at both state, local, and also in other countries to protect our climate. And this is all part of a bigger puzzle to create an equitable future. And it's all just a start. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the future. And I'll turn it back to Tony to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Evie. Yeah, we're really excited for the conversation today. And we were talking with all of the panelists in our sort of pre-meeting before this. And Marianne brought up the idea. We'd love to hear your questions. And so if you have questions, we have some experts in the room who can really answer those. And so throughout, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat, and we'll do our best to try to answer those as we go. I'm going to actually pass it over to Ben Lilliston to introduce himself. Ben is our first speaker. And then, Ben, after you introduce yourself, feel free to just jump into your presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Tony. My name is Ben Lilliston. I work at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. So we're based in Minnesota. Excuse me. We also have an office in Washington, D.C., and a small office in Berlin, Germany. We were formed during the farm crisis of the 1980s to look at national and international policies that were affecting that crisis, where we lost hundreds of thousands of family farm households during that period. Um, and the Farm Bill, of course, is a central part of what we do. And it comes around, just to give a quick overview, comes around every 5 years. So it's not, renewed every single year. Right now, last one was in 2018. Should have had this one renewed last year. We didn't. There's a bit of a political quagmire going on that's well beyond the Farm Bill. Um, but basically, we're struggling to get it through the House, largely because there are fiscal conservatives there that want to make a lot of cuts to important programs, including SNAP. And then there's a fight, as mentioned before, over these Inflation Reduction Act money that's coming in on a climate perspective. So I'll get into the Conservation Inflation Reduction Act spending later. And just to say that there are 12 titles in the Farm Bill, so there's a lot of pieces and there's a lot of constituencies that work on the Farm Bill. So they each are looking for their little piece of the pie. And that's what makes it very challenging sometimes to make big reforms if you want to. Um, I'm going to zero in on the conservation spending of the Farm Bill. And this is where we feel like there's a lot of potential. You can think about the Farm Bill as something for farming. You can think about it also as a food bill, but I think now we also need to think about it as a climate bill. It greatly influences a lot of what we grow in this country, how we manage land, where we grow it, where we don't grow, what we import and what we export. So it's deeply influential, not only for farmers, but for the financial system, bankers, and so forth, equipment makers. So a lot of powerful interests have a lot at stake in the Farm Bill. The conservation programs, there are different types. There's one called the Conservation Reserve Program, which sets land aside, often in marginal farmland, so land that maybe isn't as productive. And that's a very popular program. But the Inflation Reduction Act gave and infused new money into what is called working lands programs in the conservation. So the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So I'm not going to just keep talking in acronyms here, but these programs basically help working farmers make improvements on their land to improve soil health, prevent water runoff, bring more diversity to the farm, maybe more pollinators to the farm. And really what we're getting at from a climate perspective, just to take a step back, is in agriculture is about 10% of the U.S. climate emissions. The biggest sources of emissions are from nitrogen fertilizer on the one hand, which is often used to grow corn. So we have a lot of corn in this country, and that's a major source of ag-related emissions. And then the other major source is through ruminants, largely cows, in big beef and dairy operations. And it's not just the cows themselves that are emitting methane, but also the way we store the manure on these huge operations emits both methane and nitrous oxide. So but these conservation programs really offer opportunities to farmers to both, if they are interested and want it, they're voluntary programs, to put in systems that require less nitrogen fertilizer. And if they want to raise animals in a different way, and often fewer animals or different types of animals on their operation, or grow different crops, it offers them a pathway to do that. One of the exciting things I think about these conservation programs is that they are enormously popular. Like, farmers really like them and they use them a lot. So in 2022, only 25% of farmers who applied for EQIP were approved. So on the one hand, that's, kind of depressing. It's only 25%, but it's exciting because you can see a huge unmet need. And then in 2022, also with the Conservation Stewardship Program, was around 24%. So we can see that if we could get more money, we can reach more farmers and we can have a bigger climate impact. One of the challenges with the Farm Bill is that there is a baseline spending that is kind of locked in. It is very difficult to increase spending in any of the titles from year to year. And if you do, there's a competition from the other constituencies fighting for different titles. So you got to take money from somewhere else to put it over here. And it's very difficult to make big increases in spending. So in a situation like this, we can see huge demand in conservation, but it's hard to increase spending. So what the Inflation Reduction Act did was really unprecedented. We don't have that, that has not been done before to infuse $19.5 billion in conservation spending into the conservation programs. And so they added 8.45 billion to the EQIP program, and 3.25 billion for conservation stewardship program. So this is huge. And so right now we really only have, and just to reflect again, as mentioned, it is a bit of a debate in Congress right now about what to do with that money. Some folks want to take that money and put it into, kind of want to capture that money and put it into other parts of the Farm Bill. Others are fighting to keep it where it is and whether to keep it in the conservation programs or even keep it separate as it was intended. So there's a lot of budgetary machinations going on in Congress about that. But that's where that is. And we really only have 1 year of experience and numbers and data and looking at what the impact of this increase in spending has been. And I think what we found is really interesting. So in 2023, in EQIP, we still had 25% of farmers, only 25% getting approved. So what does that tell us? We also looked into the number of applicants, and of course, the number of applicants went up enormously. So you have more farmers applying for these programs, hearing about that there's more money available, but we're still only reaching 25% who apply. With CSP, we got up to 30% from 24% to 30%. So that's really good progress there, but not near to where we really need to go. I think from our perspective, pie in the sky vision, conservation programs should be available to any farmer who wants them and wants to apply for them and qualifies for them. One of the nice things about these programs is they are available to all types of farmers. Doesn't matter what you grow or produce, you can access these different programs. And farmers of all size. And they do have different carve-outs for what they call socially disadvantaged farmers in Farm Bill language, which is usually BIPOC farmers. And so I guess I would say the other big part that we are pushing for in this Farm Bill, so number one is keep the IRA spending. If we can expand it, great, but let's not lose it. And what would be great is if we can increase the conservation baseline going forward. So meaning this is now the new standard for how much we're going to spend on conservation. The other thing we want is to see EQIP reformed. And one of the problems is that EQIP also does support some of these, what we would call factory farms, or really large scale, concentrated animal feeding operations that helps them, with their waste pits, helps them with their manure lining. So it diverts important money that could be spent on conservation. We estimated somewhere around 13% of that money in the EQIP program went to those types of projects as opposed to real conservation. And the downside is that those projects are enormously expensive. So they're sucking up money that could be spent for, cover crops or more low cost with real conservation benefits. Let's see. I think I'm going to leave it at there. I will welcome questions. There's a lot to get to on conservation, a lot of detail, but I welcome any questions that you have. I'll try to pay attention to the chat, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm going to pass it over to Erica to lead us to our next speaker. Erica Piecha is our co-host for the evening. I'm realizing I didn't introduce her in the beginning, but Erica's done a lot of work with helping to put this event together and are definitely excited to keep the conversation going. And like Ben said, if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to drop those in there. And then we're also going to get into more of a discussion towards the end of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And thank you, Ben. That was a great way to kick this off. So with that all in mind, I will turn it over to our second speaker, Ranjani Prabhakar, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Erica. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you this evening. My name is Ranjani, and I work at Earth Justice as our legislative director for our Healthy Communities program. And that program really spans issues of clean air, clean water, toxics, and agriculture sort of sits maybe not neatly, but definitely heavily between those three pillars of environmental and health issues. And for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with Earth Justice, we are a environmental legal nonprofit. I believe we might be the largest environmental legal nonprofit in the country, but a lot of what we do is pro bono litigation on behalf of clients that are experiencing environmental harms. But we also have a policy arm that's based in Washington, D.C., and I lead one of the teams in our policy shop. So without further ado, I will kick into my presentation, which sort of builds off of a lot of what Ben was saying in terms of the Farm Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the impacts of climate change. I do have a presentation that is in Evie's hands, so I'll just make sure she has what she needs to start that.
You see my screen?
Evie. I do, yeah.
It'll get that started.
Yeah. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I'm going to run through a little bit about the Farm Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the impacts of climate change, but really honing down on what the Inflation Reduction Act is. I know folks have heard about the ongoing negotiations to reauthorize the Farm Bill, and maybe you knew or you didn't know that one of the most contentious issues in terms of negotiating across the aisle is the allocation of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is nearly $20 billion in climate-related agriculture funding. So let's move on to the next slide. So I wanted to get through what the real impact of IRA is, especially on farmers, and then also debunk a couple of the myths that we've been hearing in Washington on what the Inflation Reduction Act maybe doesn't do or does do that Republicans especially think is harmful and is impacting a negotiation from happening. Next slide. So it's important to talk first about, what you should know about IRA. Inflation Reduction Act, I will be calling IRA from this point. Just some key facts. One is that it supports climate smart practices and funding at $20 billion over 4 years, which is akin to the amount of money that's in the conservation title, which is $30 billion over 5 years in terms of what the 2018 Farm Bill looks like. So basically, this is a lot of money, and it's the first of its kind in terms of critical climate ag funding. Farmers strongly support these funds. There's been a huge demand for climate smart conservation funding, especially for things like cover crops, greatly exceeding expectations. Ben mentioned this, but there is an oversubscription of the traditional USDA conservation programs. And so that just goes to show that farmers love those programs. They see the benefit of them, and IRA funding goes directly towards those USDA programs and makes them stronger. So there's a lot of support from farmers. And we've seen that IRA has helped reduce the backlog of farmers that have been turned away by USDA because USDA has insufficient funding for these programs because demand is continuing to outpace the supply. I'll get into this a little bit more, but just to provide some context, over 100,000 farmers were turned away from USDA conservation funding in the 2022 assistance cycle alone. So that already highlighted the need for continued support, and then IRA came right along. So the second thing you need to know is about the climate and environmental benefits of IRA. That again is historic in terms of the investment that we haven't seen at USDA before. I think you're probably all in the room because you're concerned about agriculture and its significant growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, it accounts for 11% of US emissions. It's even higher than 11% if you include methane, not just, the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon. But without any action, like if we did nothing to address this, it could rise from 11% to 32% by 2050. And that's, almost 25 years away. And so that's the basic gist to know about the climate and environmental benefits. A lot of common conservation practices like crop rotations and cover cropping could reduce annual emissions by a lot. I mean, equivalent to removing like 1 million cars from the road. And I mean that very literally in terms of some of the data that we've seen. And so IRA really gives us a chance at putting an investment into reducing these emissions and funds programs within USDA or strengthens them so that the investment that's going through these USDA programs is channeled towards climate smart practices. And right now, we're not necessarily seeing that. Programs like EQIP, Environmental Quality Improvement Program, a lot of that funding is going towards CAFOS administrative and legal fees. There's actually a 50% carve out for that alone. And so the IRA money can come in, infuse more billions of dollars into EQIP and make sure that that money is mostly going to farmers and assisting them with their conservation resource management as opposed to helping CAFOs with their legal settlements. And then the last thing to know, there is resilience to climate change is sort of the central thesis of the IRA, and there's so much broad support. There are climate smart practices that are funded through IRA that help farms withstand extreme weather, droughts, floods, extreme moisture, which are becoming common, obviously, due to climate change. And farmers are using practices like cover cropping very often in making their operations more resilient to extreme weather, but then also reducing economic damage. So there's sort of a financial benefit of addressing climate change in agriculture. And IRA has broad support from I think it's over like 1,000 different farms and small farm businesses across the country. And voters have preferred funding climate smart practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions by like a 2-to-1 margin when surveyed. So basically, if Congress does remove like the climate safeguards that are in IRA, USDA could very easily continue their old habits, or I guess revert to old habits now that IRA is here. Because right now, before IRA, only a fraction of conservation funding was going to greenhouse gas fighting practices. So keeping these rules in place is crucial. We'll go to the next slide. So why do we need IRA? There are a couple reasons, but I just wanted to circle in on 2 specific ones. One is the impact of oversubscribed USDA programs and what IRA can do to fix that. And then the other is addressing inequities, historical inequities at USDA and what IRA can do there. So in terms of oversubscription, until IRA, most farmers offering to help voluntarily reduce emissions were turned away by USDA. And until we had this $20 billion of climate smart agriculture funding, before that, 75% of farmers and ranchers were turned away when they were seeking USDA conservation funding because there was insufficient funding. And the number of farmers being turned away has only increased. And I think those numbers, that 75% numbers from 2022. So now that IRA money is actually starting to have checks cut out and be out the door, we're seeing an improvement in terms of farmers actually having that money in hand. Because 75% of applicants being turned away is a lot. So this is reducing that amount of backlog. The other thing is that USDA, they can spend this money. With, as I said, over 100,000 farmers being turned away in 2022, USDA was only able to finance about 15% of climate smart projects that were proposed by farmers offering to voluntarily reduce emissions. But now they actually have the keys to IRA funding that they can spend right now. And so I'll talk about this a little bit in the debunking section. But one issue that we're seeing is that Republicans are looking at a congressional budget report and saying that USDA is not able to spend down this money efficiently or within the 4 years that are allotted, but USDA has proven that they're already doing that. And it's really important to make sure that agencies have the keys to critical funding so that they can dole them out to where there's critical need and go straight to the source, which is farmers and ranchers. The other thing to note about the oversubscription is that with IRA, all farmers and ranchers are eligible for climate smart funding. It doesn't matter what they grow. It doesn't matter what they live, where they live. They are eligible for the funding. And so that is very helpful because by contrast, most farmers and ranchers were not eligible for farm subsidy programs in the traditional sense of the conservation programs. So the oversubscription and this taking care of the overflow make sure that more farmers are sort of within the USDA subsidy infrastructure. And then I wanted to talk about IRA and inequities at USDA. BIPOC farmers, specifically Black farmers and Indigenous farmers, have historically faced systemic discrimination from USDA, suffered severe economic setbacks and land loss. In the 1920s, just as an example to set the context, that was 100 years ago. And Black farmers operated 1 out of 7 US farms, but today they make up less than 2% of all. They make up 2% of all farmers, and they own less than 1% of all farmland in America. So there's been this long history of exclusion from federal farm programs. There's been discriminatory lending practices, lack of access to credit. All of these things have significantly contributed to there being a racial wealth gap in rural America. Not that all farmers are only in the rural landscape, but despite efforts to address these inequalities, where there were farmers successfully suing USDA for racial discrimination, there have still been very few payouts, very little debt relief, and despite legal action, many Black farmers continue to face challenges at accessing USDA programs, let alone actual farmland. So there's 2 parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that aims to address these persistent inequities. One allocates about $3 billion for distressed borrowers. So that's offering loan modifications, financial relief to farmers facing economic hardships, particularly those who have struggled due to historical inequities in lending. But then also to mention, COVID, there's been pandemic-induced market disruptions that have really exacerbated the intensity of the economic disadvantage of BIPOC farmers, and then also climate-driven disasters. And as they have persisted, this assistance is really vital. And so there's the economic hardships, distressed borrowers relief funding in IRA. The other pot of IRA that's helpful is $2 billion for farmers who experience discrimination in USDA lending programs. So here we're directly compensating farmers who were denied loans, face discriminatory practices at any point in history. And then recently, July of this year, USDA announced a discrimination financial assistance program, DFAP, that has already sent out awards to 43,000 farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners who reported discrimination and were eligible under the program but did not receive any funding. And so distribution of these funds is also, another step in what will be kind of a long march towards a more inclusive and equitable USDA. And my last slide.
Ranjani, we'd like to transition just to make sure we have some space for the
sure.
other speakers. And so maybe if you have just a final couple words
sure.
to wrap up.
Yeah, I guess if you just go to my last slide for people just to look at it, I just wanted to debunk a couple myths about IRA, and I'll just say one last line about it, which is that IRA is not a limited benefit to farmers. It can include everybody, and there's a myth that it leaves traditional conservation practices behind by Republicans. And so I think debunking these three myths is going to be important to passing the Farm Bill. All right, thank you.
And thank you so much. I'm just going to pass it right over to Christopher BOSSO. If you want to just introduce yourself and jump into your presentation.
Hi, Christopher BOSSO. I'm professor of public policy and politics at Northeastern University in Boston. I'm a political scientist, and I study the politics of the Farm Bill and of SNAP. Actually, I have a book on the Farm Bill, framing the Farm Bill on the 2014 Farm Bill, and I just had a book come out on the political history of the SNAP program, of SNAP and food stamp program. So, and so I'm one of these weird people who actually pay attention to the politics of the Farm Bill, even though I work at an urban university, and I, had a piece about why everybody should pay attention to it, and I'll actually put the link to that in. Oops, that's not the link. Never mind. Forget that link. There's a piece that I wrote that, it basically explains why most of us who are not producers should pay attention to the Farm Bill. And it's because it is one of these my eyes glaze over pieces of legislation that historically only producers paid attention to. But over time, what's happened, so there's always been this asymmetry of attention on the Farm Bill. That is, the people who grew the crops, that's a sort of a natural incentive structure. The people who grew the crops, especially the larger operations as they evolved over time. And the Farm Bill indirectly hastened the industrialization of much of agriculture in the United States. It didn't directly drive it as much as people think. That was technology driven, but certainly the Farm Bill with its incentive structures behind its subsidy systems, its crop management systems, incentivizes the get big or get out kind of agriculture that dominates American agriculture today. And most of the Farm Bill is really most relevant to industrial agriculture in terms of historical sort of commodity programs and indeed many of its programs. Small farmers, the typical farmer who grows, say, crops for the farmer's market, the Farm Bill almost does nothing for that farmer. The insurance programs are typically too expensive for those farmers. They grow too many different kinds of crops, so it's not worth it to them. They're too small, they're too specialized. So much of the Farm Bill, at least to the kind of agriculture that a lot of people in this room, I suspect, want to support, historically has been pretty irrelevant until relatively recently, when you started getting more specialized programs put in the Farm Bill, like for urban agriculture, for organic, for special crops, so-called specialty crops, for farmers markets, for nutrition programs. What's happened over time is that as America itself became an urban and suburban country, the traditional farm bloc needed allies, especially in the House, which as the House of Representatives became more and more suburban and less rural and less agriculturally oriented, the farming interests in the House needed to build allies with non-farm interests or different kinds of interests. So hence the reason why, if you look at the Farm Bill, more in the 12 titles that Ben mentions, you'll see the Farm Bill is essentially one big sort of mess of different kinds of programs, oftentimes programs that were created by different pieces of legislation and brought into the Farm Bill umbrella over time precisely to build votes, to get the darn thing passed. And the biggest piece of that over time was SNAP, which was brought into the Farm Bill when the food stamp program brought into the Farm Bill in the 1970s. Separately, it's a separately authorized program. SNAP is authorized under the Food Stamp Act of 1964, which just celebrated its 60th anniversary. And so technically, even if the Farm Bill lapses, SNAP does not. But it's in the Farm Bill to bring in votes of urban and suburban Democrats in particular, who might not ordinarily care about subsidy programs for crops, in fact, might oppose them. So it has always been the politics of the Farm Bill to bring in more constituencies to build votes, which means inevitably it gets to be a big, unwieldy mess of piece of legislation, what they call an omnibus piece of legislation. And the biggest fault lines right now in the Farm Bill, that the thing, and it's already been alluded to, is that getting votes for the Farm Bill has always been hard. It's always been balancing different crops against each other. What's good for cotton is not good for corn, is not good for wheat, or there's always been these intercrop battles, which are also regional battles. But there's also been battles, between, as time went on, about people, the interests who want to fund, the traditional crops, and the interests who want to make sure we fund nutrition programs. And there's been a struggle there over the last 40, 50 years. There's also now these other interests that have been brought in, that have come in, again, in urban agriculture and organic, specialty crops, et cetera, that want their piece of the action and have votes to trade. And all within, as Ben pointed out early, within a flat budgetary dynamic. Because what happens is the congressional budget rules are that the appropriations committees and the budget committees set a budget target, and that's what you have to live under. So there's a budget target for this new Farm Bill. I forgot what that total is over 5 years, and you have to, in fact, make anything new you want to do, you have to find the money for something from somewhere else. So it's a zero-sum game in some respects. And there's only two big pots of money right now that are at play. One is SNAP, because SNAP is always a big pot of money. It is 80% of the Farm Bill spending, technically. If you go back and actually look at the actual amount of money spent in the Farm Bill, most of it's nutrition programs, which people don't really understand. So that's the big gorilla over there. But, and so the Biden administration adjusted SNAP's benefits package a couple of years ago, which drove SNAP spending up about 20%. Now, SNAP's an entitlement program. So if you're entitled to benefits, you get them. There's no budgetary cap on SNAP. So it's the big elephant in the room, literally, in some respects. And what Republicans want to do is they want to take away or force the so the two big battles right now over that SNAP, thrifty benefits, the thrifty food plan increase. And what Republicans want to do is make it revenue neutral for the next 5 years, which Democrats would claim is effectively a cut in future spending growth because SNAP is also adjusted for inflation. So basically, what if you're on the Republican side right now, this is, I hate to put it this way, but it is a partisan split right now, pretty much. And what Republicans are seeing they look at SNAP and they see potentially over 5 years, $20-30 billion in additional spending that they would like to not have happen and apply toward commodity programs. And that's what they want to do, because because commodity prices right now are low. Farmers are feeling a bit pressured, even though they were making record profits a couple of years ago. Commodity prices, they tend to go up and down, and right now they're down. And so farmers are sort of banging on the doors of members of Congress who represent farming districts and say, we need more help. And they see the money in two places. SNAP is one of them, and the other is an IRA. And Republicans want to transform IRA from the climate smart goals that's built into IRA to maybe just being in the Farm Bill as a general pot of money to allocate among other programs, particularly commodity programs. And of course, Democrats do not want that to happen. So you have primarily a partisan split. This is true, especially in the House, where the margin is so thin that, frankly, and even some Republicans are split, that there is this sort of dynamic happening where the House Republicans, pretty much can't get anything done without, they got a Farm Bill passed only on Republican votes, but it's dead on arrival in the Senate if it gets passed at all. It's passed the House Agriculture Committee, but it's never going to pass the House without Democratic votes. It could pass, but it's dead on arrival in the Senate, and Biden will never support it. The Senate's still split, but there's more even splits. So I think what's going to happen there is, I think until the election is over, you're not going to see much progress. So that's the big fight. Is what's going to happen with these two big pots of money, and IRA being the big pot everybody's talked about already, but SNAP is another part. And the Democrats are pretty clear. You touch SNAP, the Farm Bill dies. That's pretty much it. They've been very clear about that for the last 30 years. And so for Democrats, SNAP and now IRA are in fact safe, are basically their red lines that shall not cross. So that's where we are politically on the Farm Bill. I'll let it go at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was perfect timing. So now we'll go to our final speaker, Marianne KRASNY.
Thank you. Let me just get this out of here. Okay, great. So I'm Marianne KRASNY. I'm a professor in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell University, but I'm here more in my capacity as a volunteer with the Climate Action Now app. I create letters for the app, which you'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. So just kind of the big picture, agriculture, food, and land use are about 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look at the very strong greenhouse gas methane, we can see that livestock, so basically manure management, which Ben talked about, and I think he also mentioned the stomachs, the burps you all hear about, called enteric fermentation. They're the largest source of methane, and methane is a really, really strong greenhouse gas. And they're also, the manure is a source of nitrous oxide, which is even a stronger greenhouse gas. And then you can see natural gas here is the next largest source of methane, but MSW, which is municipal solid waste landfills, is also 15%. So 2 of the 3 largest sources of methane are related to food and agriculture. Well, I'll explain why the municipal solid waste is related to food waste in a minute. Okay, so why are there so many methane emissions from livestock? So if you look at beef here, it's at the top. And look at this color coding. And you can see that there's green, that's land use change. So part of beef's emissions comes from cutting down forests or converting wetlands, to livestock operations. But the majority of it comes from the on-farm emissions, which is in brown there. And that's when we're talking about the manure and the burps from the cows. So for me, reducing my beef consumption is not a big deal. I don't really have a desire to eat beef anymore. But we get to the second one here, and it's chocolate, which was a huge disappointment for me. And I will say, a lot of people figure these out slightly differently in terms of which one, exactly what the emissions are per unit of protein or unit of calories. But you can see that chocolate is up high, whether you put it, further down or not. So where are all those emissions coming from in chocolate? In case you're a chocolate lover, land use change. So it has to do with cutting down the rainforest to plant cacao plantations. So if we could have more sustainable chocolate, where we're doing an agroforestry system, planting the cacao within the rainforest instead of totally clear cutting it, we can reduce those emissions. And you can, you can look into chocolates and how they're produced. There's actually a chocolate scorecard. So this is a great graphic. It's actually interactive. I think Tony might be putting the link in the chat. And so it's from the Washington Post. And it talks about not just climate emissions, but all the other sort of negative externalities of agriculture. So things like land use change, water pollution, in addition to climate emissions. And you can see that we eat a lot of beef and it has large emissions. So the x-axis is the overall impact per calorie, but the y-axis is how much we produce. So beef is pretty bad, but you can feel a little bit better about chocolate because even though it's sort of middle emissions, or cocoa, it actually, we don't eat so much of it. And then you can look at Rainforest Alliance certified cocoa if you are concerned. So we already talked about the IRA and the climate smart agriculture provisions. And these are some of the practices that are in the climate smart ag provisions. And the ones that are going to be most effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions are the ones I think that have to do with manure and fertilizer here. Of the others, the science is a little bit split on how much good they're going to do for reducing actually climate emissions, but of course they have other values in terms of reducing water runoff and so forth. Okay, so now I'm going to get to what we can do about it. And I'm going to talk about Climate Action Now, which is an app. So what this is, you can download it on your phone, or I'll give you a QR code in a minute to download it if you don't already have it downloaded. And then people like me, we write letters that users of the app can send to public officials as well as corporations and the media. So this is an example of one of these letters. And if you had the app on your phone, you would see a lot of what we call cards like this. And there's literally thousands of these cards. So you can scroll through. They're not just on farming issues or food issues. They're on oil, energy, whatever. But if you were to click on this where it says, so you would probably see it as do it now. I see it as do it again because I've already sent this letter. So if you click on this green bar towards the bottom, then because you've put in your address when you registered on the app, and I should say the app is very good about not sharing your emails and your addresses, but I put in my address. So immediately I press that I want to send this letter, and my representative, Mark Molinaro, comes up. So he's my House representative to the House of Representatives. And so then I go to here, and this is a letter. I can edit it, but to be honest, I'm probably not, because I'm going to trust who wrote it. So I'm going to read through this quickly. And then I press send. And then it's sent to Mark Molinaro, to Representative Molinaro. And then this has some sort of interactive features. So I get some points. But if you look down here in the middle, it says, would you like to contact one of your senators to send the same message, or do you want to go on to the next action? And if I do my senators, I can do both of them. It'll go to Gillibrand and Schumer. So if I do yes. So this is a QR code for it if it's not downloaded. But if you already have it downloaded, it will go directly to that IRA Farm Climate Guardrails letter supporting keeping the IRA monies in climate smart agriculture, as the previous speakers talked about. And then you can read it, edit it, send it. The point is, if you're not going to edit them, you can send like 10 letters to public officials, probably in a minute. It's really fast. And just a few other examples. One of the other bills that a lot of people in the food ag community have been advocating for is a Food Date Labeling Act. The point here is that all those labels like best if used by, or expires by, or sell by, there's no regulations for those in the US except for baby food, or infant formula. So they're basically, the dates are decided on by the companies. And you can imagine that the companies might have an incentive to have a date before the food actually goes bad, because it might be when the taste is greatest, or just because they want to sell more food. So On the right, you can see the card for the letter that would support the Food Aid Labeling Act. And I just gave this example because here, instead of sending it to my congressman, I'm going to send it directly to the House and Senate Ag committees. And then we have lots of others. So here are some QR codes to the Food Aid Labeling Act. And over on the right is a SNAP Act, incentives for buying produce. So people who receive SNAP benefits, if they buy fresh fruits and vegetables, they will get more SNAP monies. So it's again to sort of promote healthy eating, and from my perspective, to promote also low climate impact eating. And we do have a few actions getting back to that chocolate issue on cocoa also. I don't have the QR code right now for that one, but if you download the app, and here's the link, then you can search Farm Bill, food waste, cocoa, any, all kinds of other things also, whatever kind of climate issue that you're interested in. So that is it. I will go up, and I don't know if there's any questions, or Tony or Evie, you're going to close us out. I think we have 4 minutes for questions, but I'll leave this up in case anybody wants to scan it. Or you can tell me to stop share if that's what you'd prefer that I do.
You can leave it up for now, Marianne. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about the Climate Action Now app. I think what I've recognized in listening to everyone here tonight is that we probably needed 2 or 3 hours for this conversation, because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the Farm Bill. It's a huge piece of legislation, but I like what you share here, because this is an actual opportunity to take action, right? And so we can talk about these things, but this is a real way to do it. And so I highly encourage folks to check out the Climate Action Now app. It makes taking action on some of these issues really easy. You have a little scorecard that counts your actions, and then you get points, and it makes it really easy. And so I guess with the time that we have left, we just have about 3 minutes. So I can't imagine that we're really going to get into, a big discussion. And I want to be considerate of everybody's time, but I guess maybe some key things that I've kind of noticed is, beyond there being a lot of different elements included within the Farm Bill, is that there kind of seem to be a common theme around the interests of, people on the ground, farmers, people who have been historically not represented or supported, and then the interest of, large organizations. And, that's something that we think about at Change a Chamber, is the role of some of these big groups to influence policy and legislation. And so, I think that's definitely an important part of this. And I wish that we had more time to dig into that more. But I'd actually like to pass it over to Erica to close us out.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of our amazing speakers. I think this has been very informative, and has really set up our conversation well. I think I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else here has as well. So to close out, we want to promote a few things. One is our event tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. Eastern, called From Fields to Policy, Farm Bill and Food Justice. That link was just put in the chat now. If you haven't registered already and would like to hear a little bit more about what we talked about today and looking at justice, that would be great. As well, we're going to be putting the Get Out the Vote resources in the chat. Obviously, with everything that we've talked about today, voting is super, super important, especially this election. It has a lot to do with the future of the Farm Bill, but a lot to do with the future of many, many policies and bills. Next, we're going to put in a article that was authored by one of our climate fellows at Change the Chamber, who's here right now, actually, Gabby Myers. She wrote an article on the Farm Bill, so if you'd like to learn a little bit more, that's a great place as well. And finally, we're putting a link into the chat if you'd like to join Change the Chamber, be involved in what Tony and I did today, what Change the Chamber does on a daily basis. And yeah, so just thank you for everyone for joining us. Thank you for our speakers, especially. And we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, hopefully.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone. See you tomorrow.
Take care.
Thank you.